Everybody, hey, welcome to, by the way, Akwi, we're ready. We are recording. Okay, Akwi, thank you. Everybody, welcome to Cassandra Lunch number 34. Almost coming up on a year. Today we're going to be discussing Liquibase and Cassandra. Liquibase is a tool for CI/CD for schema management, which is a ridiculous problem in any database. It's definitely a problem for people doing DevOps and needing a solution in the Cassandra world. And this will be presented by Arpan Patel. Akwi is our amazing host in the background, making sure that the event happens, that we record, we publish the notes and the deck, you name it. Thank you so much, Akwi, for taking care of that. We're always looking for folks to help organize and present. Feel free to put your email in the chat box if you're interested in presenting something. We have a huge backlog of ideas and topics that people have recommended, which I'll show in a second. But if you have something that you want to talk about, I'd love to have you come and present. We are part of a larger, broader, diverse group of data practitioners called Data Community DC. We want everybody from all backgrounds to come and participate, especially represented communities. We, as I said, we're part of a larger community. There's tons of other groups. In fact, we also host one of the other groups, Data Wranglers DC, on Mondays. There's a Data Engineers Lunch. Just look for Data Wranglers DC, and you'll see it. There's a recurring event every Monday. What do we cover here? So we covered things related to Cassandra. Cassandra protocol is now implemented in cloud platforms like Cosmos and in Amazon Key Spaces. I think that's what it's called now, as well as other technologies built on C++, Yugabyte and Scala. So we'll get around to those topics. But of course, we also talk about DataStax. There's also another thing called Cassandra. And not just the actual core database, but the things that surround Cassandra. So Spark, Kafka, Kubernetes. I think we'll want to do something on Airflow, and how it really relates to Cassandra. So at this time, in our physical meetup, when we had it, we would ask people who had not met each other to introduce themselves. Well, if you're new to this meetup, love for you to say hi, who you are, what brings you here, and if you wanted to, you could say, well, this is what I want to learn here, or you could also say, this is what you could present on. We'd love to have you present. So I'm gonna take some volunteers. Anyone? Okay, so I see Kevin. There's two Kevins. So either of the Kevins, if you want to just say hi. All right, I can't hear them. That's okay. Richard, do you want to say hi? Okay. Well, maybe they can't hear me. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
We'll move on. Group rules during the presentation. You can just chime in with more information. Just be polite. Make sure that you're adding value to the conversation. This is a conversation because we're a community. Community means that we communicate together. This is never supposed to be a one-way presentation, and it's more about learning from each other. That's what meetups were formed for. They were originally called user groups because we learn from each other. So we'd love to hear from you in the presentation, or afterwards we'll have a general chit chat as well. Our company, Anant, we do stuff with Cassandra, Spark, and Kafka. Basically, we do data analytics platforms for large companies using real-time technologies. DataStax is a partner, and I just realized their logo is it needs to be updated. GW University is a great physical venue provider, as well as they've provided monetary support in the past, data community DC as a whole. We have some local sponsors who pay for pizza and soda and have given us spaces to host events in DC, Virginia, and in Chicago. Our organizational sponsors, they get, by the way, just as like a plug for Data Community DC, if an organizational sponsor or just a meetup sponsor for just one of the meetups, they put money down, it's tax deductible, but they get exposure in meetups like this. So if you work for a company that wants to have some exposure, it's really like a steal, because there's about 20,000 people in all of Data Community DC across the 12 or so meetup groups. All right, any announcements or things coming up? If you have a job you want to offer, you are looking for a job, there are any events on something that you're putting together, love to talk about it. Okay, and seeing none, just a reminder, this Cassandra lunch is every Wednesday at noon Eastern. There's a data engineers lunch, as I mentioned, every Monday at noon Eastern. And just it's kind of sampling of upcoming topics, Airflow and Cassandra, as I mentioned, Jenkins and Cassandra, Kubernetes and Cassandra. The reason they're up here is because in conversations with people we work with, people that come to this meetup, these are questions that come up. So we're putting them up, and if somebody wants to present on them, great. Otherwise, I'll do it. I'll ask somebody else to do it. These videos are all on YouTube, so you can go ahead to Google or YouTube and look for Cassandra Lunch and subscribe. There are roughly, not exactly 34 videos, because we didn't record the first 10 or so, but there's at least 20, 25 videos from Cassandra Lunch, and then there's also Data Engineers Lunch up there as well. And how could I not forget? Cassandra.Link is our knowledge base on Apache Cassandra. It aggregates several blogs, as well as has about 1,000 and more hand-curated resources about Cassandra and all things related to Cassandra. Look for you to check it out and sign up for our mailing list there. Okay, and with that, I will hand it to our presenter, Arpan Patel. I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
All righty. So as Rahul mentioned, we're going to be covering Liquibase and Cassandra today. Liquibase is a data schema change management solution, but we're going to be focusing it on specifically Cassandra, but you can use it with a whole bunch of other databases to manage, do DevOps, DBA work, and have it tracked. So a little about me. I'm a junior engineer here at Anant. I recently wrapped up a series on doing Apache Spark connections and jobs with DataStax Astra. If you're interested in that, you can find that on Anant's YouTube channel, youtube.com/Anant. The scenario we use in those two demos, also in our Cassandra real-time workshop that we do with DataStax, we take a look at how we can do Spark, Kafka, real-time architecture with a basis of kind of how we structure Cassandra.Link. And I'll talk a little bit more about that once we get into the demo. So if you're not familiar with what Liquibase is, it's an open source database schema management solution, which enables you to manage your revisions and database changes easily. They have their licenses that you can get. So you can get like a pro, business, or enterprise license, but they have their community edition, which we will be using for the demo. And with Liquibase, you can eliminate errors and delays when releasing databases, do deploys and rollbacks for specific versioning using context and labels. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the concepts. You can also deploy databases and make application changes so that they're always in sync. So that way you're not running into migration errors, especially when you're working with something like Cassandra, which you start with data modeling and then you build your data model and then you make your tables afterwards. So if in a real world data is always changing, you may need to expand or make edits to your schemas and your key spaces, or just your data model in general. This could be a tool that you can use for that and have it tracked. You can make rollbacks, revisions, etc. Liquibase also provides Liquibase Hub, which you can do organizing, monitoring, visualization of database changes in real time. And this will allow you to increase collaboration and deployment success. And then also just in general, overall monitoring. So you can always be on top of it. All right. And then the main concepts of what Liquibase is they have a master changelog file. In this changelog, you can think of it as a ledger because it's a list of all your changes in order made to your database. You can have a couple different formats of what the file is. We'll also discuss that in the demo, but you can do SQL. But in our case, the SQL, we can just write CQL. And we have an example of that once we get to the demo. You can also do XML, as seen on the right with a screenshot. You can do JSON, you can do YAML, and they also have community extensions for Groovy and Clojure. And then within these changelog files, you could have nested elements like preconditions. So say if you want to migrate something, if you want to migrate to your new or create a new table or roll back on something, you want to precondition it. So if something doesn't exist or if something does exist, do your rollback or update there. And then you could have different properties, change set, which is an individual single change to your database, which is also another big concept. So in this screenshot we see here, within this changelog entirety, we have one change set, two change set, three change set, four change set. So we have 4 different changes we're making to our database. And those are individual pieces of the entire changelog. And then, as I mentioned, you can have contexts, and you can also have labels to have further control on your version control and your management of your database. And the changelog you can make dynamic substitutions using variables as needed, but you can read more about that. The documentation is linked as the header of the bullet. So again, a little bit more on change sets. You can have additional attributes and subtags, and they're also uniquely identified with an author and an ID. So that way you can mark who's making the change and at what ID it's at. So if you need to track that, and when you run Liquibase, it creates and updates tables within your, well, for us, Cassandra instance. And we'll talk about that once we get to the database changelog table and then the database changelog lock table. All right. And then this is a little bit more about change sets. These change sets are read in order. So again, as kind of like a ledger, they're read in order. And then the database changelog table, which is created when Liquibase runs, it'll get checksummed to make sure that the ID, author, and file path have not already been run. If they have been run, then it'll not run it. And then they also attempt to execute each change set as a transaction. And if there's an error, it'll roll back and fail. And then it's usually best practice to have only one change per change set. So generally, like general migration best practices, you don't want to make too many changes per migration. So when you're moving from v1.01 to v.1.02, sorry, it's getting jumbled up. You're not trying to say make 5 tables, right? You're just saying make 1 table or alter table, etc. All right. And then, as I mentioned, so the database changelog table and the database changelog lock table, those two get created when you run your first Liquibase update. And the database changelog table tracks which changelog table or change sets have been run. And then again, as mentioned, they're uniquely identified by their ID, author, and then the file name. So usually like if your DB changelog ledger is DB changelog.sql, it would be marked as DB changelog.sql. Or if you run another set from an XML file, it would track it there. So you can see which commands are running from which file. And then the lock table essentially ensures only one instance of Liquibase is running. So if you're working on this collaboratively, and you have multiple team members working out of one database changelog file, so like one ledger file, this will make sure that only one set can be run at a time. And then a little bit more about contexts. So you can add these contexts to your table. Oopsies. There's a question, sorry. Ion asks, is there a timeout available if you want to make sure a certain chain doesn't take too much time? I don't remember reading any thoughts a timeout limit. You could check their documentation and be part of the commands. So like when running update, set that as a parameter in the command line. That potentially could be implemented, but I may have to get back to you on that one. Okay. And the context, if you don't assign a context to a change set, they will continually be run. They would be continually ran. So if you're in your command line, contexts are generally for like your environment. So when you're running something, if you have tables that have a context set to dev, and you want to only make changes to your context or to the schema that has the context of tag of dev, you would just do like Liquibase -- context equals dev. So that way you don't have to make physical changes, and you can control your versioning so that your prod or stage don't get affected. And then these contexts can be used with and or not operators, and you can make them complex or as non-complex as you need. And then also when you're working with SQL files, or you can set different values for your delimiter. So generally they are just a semicolon, but if you want to change it to like an n/, you can set that. So that's generally used to prevent incomplete SQL statements getting processed in order to, again, further control or have further control of your schema migrations. All right. And then like context, labels are similar, but generally they're for understood are for labeling versions. And then also tags are for versions as well. But labels, you can also make specific updates to specific change sets that have specific labels. So like only make these change sets that have label, or like only to the tables that have like label V1.03 or something like that. And then it just makes it easier to manage and track your deployments, because you can have specific labels set to specific types of tables in your data model. And then you can also, again, like context, make complex logic. So using and or not operators and parentheses. So if you have 3 different labels you're trying to mess with, you can do that depending on how you have your logic set. And then you can also have multiple languages as the labels. So if you're using English or if you're using Spanish, those are the 2 examples Liquibase provides. But yeah, that's pretty cool. And then commands. Again, so there's a bunch of different commands. So there's create, updates, deletes, etc. And all the different commands can be found at the link listed at the bullet. And change types, those are also different changes you can make. So like alters, etc. and all those different commands can also be found at the link, and the slide deck will be available when this YouTube video goes up, as well as a blog, all the instructions, etc. And then something that I ran into that I needed to use was log level parameters. So I was into some errors that weren't necessarily, I couldn't figure out just from the initial error message. So they give you a recommendation, run with the flag of log level parameter. And so I changed it to log level debug, and I got a bigger error message. And so that's something that you can use. Generally, they're defaulted to the severe level, but you can change it as necessary depending on your command. And then they also have workflows. So these workflows are commands and features that allow you to combine steps and features to perform an action. So they provide you with templates. So if you're trying to do multi-step actions, they have examples of what you could do. And so it'd be a good thing to take a look at, so see if it could apply to you. And then they also have tools integration. So it could work with Maven, Ant, and a bunch of different other tools, and that can be found at that link there as well. All right. Oh, sorry. One more thing. You can also break up your change logs, kind of in the sense what we did in our demo, and you can make them more manageable. So you can essentially decentralize, depending on, you have one set of instructions for one side of your data model, and you have one set of instructions for another side of your data model. So you could, with using your context labels and tags, adjust as necessary and break it up and make it cleaner for yourself. All right. I'll stop here for any questions, see if anyone has anything, or if someone would like to add something, if they know if I missed out on something, or if they have a better idea of something I explained.
Just a quick question. So you mentioned about something about a database lock, table lock. So I understand that that basically disallows certain operations from running if something else is already running. But my question is, so let's say you break up your changes into several different change sets. Let's say that you have one change set that isn't applied, but there's another change set that would have come after it. Is there a way that it knows, hey, I can't run this change set here, B, before I run this change set A over here?
You could potentially make that a precondition.
Okay.
If it works like that, that could potentially be.
Like in the
'Cause I know, yeah. So the preconditions I know from the examples I saw were mainly for like checks, so checking data. But I don't see why not. That you could say check your database log file and check if the ID is there. So like check if, so if you're running ID 5 and ID 4 is the one that hasn't been run yet, and say check if ID 4 exists in the database change log file. So that could potentially be a precondition you have set.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Yes, the log record is persisted in Cassandra, and we'll show you that in the demo.
This is Yon. I have a follow-up question on the one that you just answered.
Yeah.
So if it's persisted in Cassandra, do you have control on the consistency level of the log record? Because I feel like that's the most sensitive one, and you really want to persist that across the whole cluster.
I'm not entirely sure. You may need to look at the Liquibase and Cassandra extension, because I think it's still being actively developed, because there are some things I noticed during when I was setting up the demo that some things the SQL file can't do that the XML file can. And then the same thing applies for like the JSON file. But I would think that it would just get written.
Yeah, you see the issue here, right? If one process is making that record and another one runs and doesn't have the most recent value, then you might end up having two processes doing the same thing at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think, I mean, I'm venturing to guess this, but I think it probably writes it using consistency all or consistency serial. And I'm fairly aware in other systems that do things like this, that they would use a lightweight transaction, right? So, and you can use lightweight transactions to basically build a ledger such that you can say, you know, if this thing doesn't exist, then do this, right? And
Right, yeah.
and the output of that thing is basically the input of the next one. So kind of like a chain, like a blockchain. But I don't know. I'm guessing that it would definitely do something like consistency all or consistency.
Yeah, I'm curious how they do it. Okay, cool. No problem. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so we will go ahead and move on to the demo section. So we'll be using Liquibase. You can use the installer or just get the tar GC and extract and add it to path as needed. You will need it to add to path for the CLI. And then we'll be using local DSC and DataStax Studio just so that that's just my Cassandra that I use on my local computer and DataStax Studio, so we can visualize the schemas and see what's in the database changelog file easily. And then also we'll talk about DataStax Astra and Liquibase. There is a GitHub repo for the demo changelogs and properties files that I will be using. It is pending update depending on some DataStax Astra issues that I can resolve. And then there's also some additional docs. So you will need a couple other jars in order to connect to Cassandra, and we'll talk about that in a second. So there's a Cassandra setup, and then there's an Astra setup, which are essentially the same. As you can imagine, if you worked with Astra, you'll need the Secure Connect bundle. So that's the only main difference. And then the Liquibase has a blog on Liquibase and Cassandra, but they use a Dockerized Cassandra. So if you're interested in doing that, you can try it. But in that blog, they use only an SQL changelog file. In demo today, we'll be using an SQL file and a XML file to show you how you can do both things and some differences that exist between those two types of files. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Going back to the scenario of the demo. So if you're familiar with Cassandra.Realtime or you came to any of my other webinars, we created tables. So modeling Cassandra.Link. So Cassandra.Link has this master list of articles, and this master list of articles has a URL, title, date, tags, etc. And then also, there's also this tag section. So we want to have a tags table, which has a count, as you can see here. So the tag of Spark has a count of 128. A tag count of Kafka has 82. But when you click on Kafka, we see a collection of posts, 82 posts that contain the tag of Kafka. So they're filtered if they contain the tag. And so in the data model, we would have two tables or three tables. So one would be the initial leaves table, which is the master list, a leaves by tag table, which is an example of this. So by tag, all the URLs and the other metadata that's associated with it. And then the tags table, which is the count of each individual tag. And then if we go to the documentation for Liquibase and Cassandra, there are some prerequisites, obviously downloading and installing Liquibase, but you will need the Simba JDBC driver in order to talk to Cassandra. And you would just put that jar in the lib directory of Liquibase. And then you would also need the Liquibase Cassandra extension. Obviously, you can just follow the instructions here. They will be linked in the slide deck and blog, and most likely the repo as well, once everything gets updated. And we will go ahead and look at Studio. So as I mentioned, we would have this initial leaves table. So there's ID, tags, title, URL. I'm not going to be actually, going to select my key space. I'm not actually going to be manipulating any data. This is strictly for database migrations and versioning, just to show you how you can do it, specifically with Cassandra. You can, so if you go to Liquibase's Cassandra extension repo, they have an example where you can use XML and SQL files to insert statements, but we'll leave that to actual data manipulation. So going to our Liquibase project folder, we will need a Liquibase properties file, and then our ledger files. So for the local Cassandra, and then we'll discuss the differences between the Astra Liquibase properties file and then the Apache Cassandra DSC Liquibase properties file. So in this Liquibase properties file, which is read by Liquibase to essentially say, here are my configs. Obviously, when you're using the command line, you can override it. So if you're like familiar with Spark, you can override what values are in this config file as necessary. But essentially all we're saying is the changelog file, so our ledger file that has our change sets, the URL, so the JDBC URL, ours for the local Cassandra would just be localhost and then the port, and then whatever your key space is. So mine's called demo, and then demo for the default key space value, username, password, default schema name as well here. And that's all we need for the Liquibase properties file when you're using local DSC or Apache Cassandra. But when we go into the changelog file itself, we're going to first start off with the SQL version, and then we're also going to make changes with the XML version. So we are going to use changelog SQL. So when you're creating this, you can follow along also on their docs. But our examples obviously are a little bit different, but essentially it's what we're saying. So we have our change set, we have our author, and we have our ID. And then we're also adding a comment, and we're saying we're adding the leaves by tag table. So when we do this, we can also add additional flags. So we can add -- context, -- label, but I don't know, it didn't work from the SQL file. And I don't know if that's the Liquibase Cassandra extension issue or it's a SQL changelog file issue. I wasn't able to find more information about it, but just in general, the XML, JSON, and YAML files look like they can have more properties set. But just to learn how to quickly get started with the changelog in the SQL format, for us, it's just a CQL statement. So all we need to say is create table and then our columns, data types, and then set our primary key with our partition and then potential clustering columns. So once we're in our directory, assuming you have already set Liquibase to your path, all you need to say is, but before I do that, I'm just going to confirm we don't have a database changelog file. We are going to say Liquibase. Just for start, we're just going to say status. And then this will show us that we have one change sets that we have not applied. So if you're just doing versioning, or it's kind of like a git status, where you just want to see if there's any updates that haven't been made, or if you accidentally did something and you need to roll back, you can. But since we have one change set in this SQL file, because it's being pointed to as our changelog file path and our properties file, we'll just say Liquibase update, and that's it. Again, as I mentioned, you can override properties in this file by attaching them as flags in the command line. But essentially, our update was successful. So if we go back to,
I think you killed your Chrome.
whoops. There we go. I thought I killed Slack. Apologies. I'm going to move this here so that we can just slide between. Okay, so let's go back to, so now in our schema of demo, we have a database changelog file or table, and we have our database changelog file. So as I mentioned, Liquibase, when running new updates, it'll check the changelog file just to make sure no other processes are being run. And then it'll also check the changelog file with MD5 checksums to make sure if the author ID and path, etc., if that command or if that change set has already been run. So if we go to our changelog file, we see our ID of one, the author, and then we see the file name, which it came from. When we use db changelog XML, we'll see that. So we can see which file these change sets are coming from. So it picked up our comments. But again, I tried adding context and I tried adding labels, but they didn't come through. So I just took them out for the SQL part of it. And we can see the date executed, deployment ID, description, so what kind of file it's coming from, execution type, so it was executed. Labels, again, like context, you can further drill down. Liquibase version, and then the MD5 checksum that Liquibase uses to make sure it hasn't been run. Also, the order executed. So if you're running things like Rahul, your scenario, you can potentially use the order executed as a precondition. I'm assuming you can, because if you can use a precondition to check your data, I'm assuming you can check the database changelog file or database changelog table. Yeah, so that's all you need is a CQL statement in the SQL changelog ledger. If we go back to the properties file, and we're now going to switch over to the XML format. So if we change this to XML, we're going to have a little bit more complicated change sets in terms of just properties we've added, because the SQL file is just very simple. We just have author ID and then the comment. But if we look at the XML file, this stuff you can just copy and paste from their examples. But essentially, the first change set we're going to make is we're going to tag the database as a version. So the first version, because we couldn't tag it in the SQL version, we're tagging it as the second change set, and we're saying this is now version 1.01. So moving forward, we are now in version 1.01. And then we have context. So the context is versioning, and then labels. So if we want to roll back or do something of the sort, we can use the tag that we just created there. And we'll talk about that once we get to the next part of the demo. And then the third change set we're going to run is we're going to add the tags table. As I mentioned, the individual tag and then the count associated with that. In our Spark and our real time, we used just a manual entry in the repo. Just say, hey, insert your CQL or insert this in your Astra Studio. This way, we can't easily see who created that and when they created that. So this allows us to track who made what and have additional version controlling on say, if we didn't need this table yet, we can just roll back. And so what we're doing is we're adding a comment saying add text table. And then here, so they have a change type where it's instead of SQL that we're using here, it's a create table, and then you would have the column set. I tried doing that. I think it might be a Cassandra Liquibase issue that they haven't fixed yet, or they're still working on. So when you're setting your column, so like here, it would be tag, and then the column type or whatever it was would be text. And then you would need to set constraint on it that would set the primary key. So if you didn't have the constraint primary key, it would fail. And when I set the primary key as true, it didn't like it. So I'm assuming that's a Cassandra thing, and it hasn't accounted for it yet. So we ended up just using the SQL, which you can obviously do just like we did in the Liquibase, or sorry, the changelog SQL file. We'll just do 2 tags of SQL and then just write a CQL statement in. And so we're just doing that. So we just say, here's our CQL statement. And then we're adding a little bit of version controlling. So we're saying, if we need to roll back, here's a rollback method. So we're saying roll back, and then a CQL statement, drop table, tags as needed. So we'll go ahead and confirm that our changelog is now XML. and then we will go ahead and run status again, and we should see that there's now 2 updates that have not been run. And that's correct. 2 change sets have not been applied. So now if we run base update, all right, update is successful. So now if we go back to DataStax Studio and we rerun our select all, we can now see the new records or the new change sets being tracked in our database changelog table. So here, see how the context came in here because we have those in the XML format. I noticed that it was throwing errors when I tried to have a comment within the tag or the change set to which created the tag. So maybe that's a Liquibase thing where you can only have that single subset, only say tag database. That potentially may be a work in progress, not entirely sure. Essentially, we can see our date executed and see our description. So even though our file type was XML, the tag we're using is specifically SQL because that's our tag. I'm gonna take a quick stop here. Can everybody still see my screen?
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so then we still see the exec type, which is executed. But now that we are using the XML version, we can see our new labels. So if we need to run a Liquibase update and we have further change sets that have the same label as 1.01 or 1.02, we can say only apply it to these specific change sets. The same thing with context. And then we can have more complicated operations with the and or bang operators in parentheses. And then again, we can see our order executed. And then additionally, now we have a tag that we can use as version control as necessary. So using that, if we go back to Liquibase and we say Liquibase rollback. So when you're using the rollback command, you will need to append it with the tag. So our tag here is tag version 1.0.1. And so ideally, when I press this, it will roll back creating this table. So it will drop the tags table and it will roll back so that we only have the leaves by tag table and the leaves table. So we will have two change sets that will get rolled back, and we only have those 2 tables left that we created earlier. So when running this, we'll see that it says rolling back ID 3, rolling back ID 2. There we go. Rolling back XML 3, the author, ID author, rolling back change set from the XML file, ID 2, me. And then if I go back to my schema, we can see that we only have our leaves and the leaves by tag table. So if we reselect all from database changelog, it updates the changelog. So it successfully rolled back and we applied version control. And now we have a ledger of seeing what changes we need to make. So if we need to make edits or we need to add on to something and still have these same version controls, we can. Yeah, Liquibase is a great tool for just DevOps and DBA management in general. There may continually be updates made for the Liquibase and Cassandra because again, I believe it's still being worked on because it's being updated as necessary. But yeah, it's definitely a great tool. Now we will talk about the Astra. So I've shout out to the Liquibase team. They're great response time. We had some issues with connections and we had jumped on a Zoom call. So shout out the Liquibase team. But if we're connecting to Astra, so we are now done with local Cassandra/DB. So if we're looking at the Astra Liquibase properties file, we are going to, let me change this to back to Cassandra, or I'll do local for now. Okay, so for the local, you can see our URL is just the JDBC and then localhost and then port and then key space. That same thing will apply for the Astra version. However, the URL will also need other parameters in it, and it's talked about in their Astra documentation, but we'll just go through it really quickly. So this host, port, and key space, well, obviously your key space, you know it in Astra, it's pretty easy to find, but the host and port, all you need for that is just to download your zip file and unzip it. And then looking in your config JSON, you can get your host and port. You can just copy and paste those in. And then your UID is just your username. And then your password is your password. And then you will also need the path for your secure connect bundle. So like mine here is secure connect Liquibase. It's within my project directory. So my relative path. Also, another thing that Liquibase recommends doing is moving on from absolute path to relative path. So trying to make everything easier. And so that way you don't have file issues when you're using absolute path. And so your absolute path, if your zip files within your project directory, it would just be secure connect and then your database.zip. And then the driver is still the same. The default schema name, again, is still your key space. So when you run this, ideally, you should get the same exact results. So I was having connection issues. So my connection kept getting timed out. But we know that my specific credentials work because, again, shout out to the Liquibase team. We convened with them yesterday and they were able to get their, using my exact credentials, get this demo working on their side. So maybe we were trying to debug it for about an hour or so. We tried using this class path. So again, as I mentioned, the jars that we download, the Simba jar file, and then the Liquibase Cassandra extension jar file, we put those in the Liquibase lib directory. So we just added some extra reinforcement to say, hey, look here for those jar files. And it didn't work for me. It potentially, we're just in the back of our head, we're just like, maybe it's a firewall thing because other people can get it to work, right? So if potentially you're using this, so if you download the repository and clone it, you could potentially get this demo to work. And once I can figure it out on my side, I will make another video. So you'll be able to find that on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/AnantCorp. And there will be instructions and the same exact demo, but for using it with Astra. But just unfortunately, I was just having timeout issues and we were not able to debug it in time. But in general, the setup is pretty simple. It's almost exactly the same, minus just the URL difference for local Cassandra versus Astra. But yeah, that'll essentially wrap up the demo portion. Yeah, I think that's about it. So anybody have any questions they want to ask before we hand it back over to Rahul?
Arpan, just one query with respect to Liquibase. You can roll back to only previous version, or you can go back to one more, in the sense previous to previous version.
You can. So so like just in our example, we rolled back to one version because that's where we have our tag set. So you could just have you could just have another change set with another tag and roll back to that specific tag. So if we have we have change set 5 and change set 4 and change set 5, and change set 5 is a new tag. So we're saying this is tag version 1.1.0, but we still want to roll back to this version. All we need to do is Liquibase rollback and then this tag version, and it should roll back to the change set 2.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, this is great, great presentation. Quick question. Is there a way to see kind of like two different, like what's the difference between like what's there now versus like I know the status tells you potentially changes, but like I thought there was a thing called like diff in Liquibase. Did you have a chance to take a look at that?
Are you talking about like something like dry run or something like that?
No. There's, I think I read somewhere that there's a command called diff in Liquibase.
Oh, yes, differences. Yes, there's a command called differences, and that can show you differences between tables.
Ah, okay. So you could be like, this is my dev, this is my stage, show me the differences, and then you can maybe make like a change set from that difference, or is that just tells you what's different?
So it's to verify all expected changes are in the changelog, or detect drift between model schema and the actual schema. So it potentially is maybe for checking your dev versus stage or stage versus prod.
But you need to basically have had run Liquibase before. Basically, you got to have those.
You have to have a database changelog file, I'm assuming.
Yeah, because it seems like I'm looking at it, basically, you got to give it the connection for both. And basically, it's like comparing the database changelog data, maybe.
Yeah.
It's worth looking. Yeah, it's worth looking into. Very cool. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so sorry, is there anybody else? I had a couple other comments. Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what, you know, we need in a lot of the projects that I'm kind of engaged with right now, where the massive data swamps, they accumulate tables and well, with Cassandra key spaces, and you know, between, let's say, dev and stage and production, there's variance across the board, on columns, on sometimes it's the database itself. The database name, the key space name is different between environments. There's no reason for it to be different. It's just there was a, you know, human element and somebody decided to name it one thing in prod and name it another thing in stage. It's just like, dude, this is like basic DevOps, you know? Yeah, why do we have different table names in different environments? So from what I understand, the way to go about it is that you should create your tables with Liquibase, and then every other change is via Liquibase. But my question is, well, what if the tables are already there? Can I just continue on with like alters and drops and just assume like there's an initial state and then everything's going to happen after that?
Yes, I believe there is a command for that. I think it's called snapshot.
Oh, okay.
Or changelog sync. I'm pretty sure I read it. So changelog sync is to baseline a new database environment, and then snapshot.
I gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is how you can kind of use the diff command to look at the differences between. Okay, yeah, cool. The snapshot basically gets a dump of what's there, right? And then we can use it to compare between. Let's see. So Nikita says that you can use this. You can use generate changelog in this case. Okay.
Cool. I think that's what it was.
I gotcha. Sweet. Very cool. Yeah. Okay. So it basically creates a sequence of change sets, which is how to basically recreate the current state of the database. So technically, I guess it would just do a you know, describe on all of the key spaces and all of the tables. And then once you have a file, a DB changelog file, and you can continue adding changes to it. All right, well, that's good. Makes it a lot easier to start using it. Cool. Very cool. Awesome. Yeah, let me just take back the screen real quick, and thank you. All right. Yeah, so just a quick note about upcoming Cassandra.Lunch. There's a backlog of topics, and there's actually even a deeper backlog of ideas that I have to kind of put in here. But Arpan, thank you so much for kind of pioneering into this tool and creating some knowledge for the whole Cassandra community. Looking forward to that update with Astra, and I think we'll probably have other sessions about Liquibase, considering that databases are especially in today's world, something like Cassandra. Once it's there, it's not going anywhere. So there's a lot of changes that need to be managed across many applications. And I think I had a lot of ideas from your talk about like how to potentially use labels to say this set of changes are for this application. So we would label it for that particular application, right? And so because generally speaking, you'll have one cluster and you'll have multiple tenants on that cluster. And so you want to be able to manage that chaos properly. So yeah, looking forward to learning more about this tool and making some internal runbooks, because I think the documentation is great, but what you showed here is a real world example, and that's what I like to see when I'm learning something. So thanks a lot, and we are at the top of the hour. Thank you all for joining. Don't forget to subscribe to the Cassandra Lunch YouTube channel, which you may be watching this on, as well as the Cassandra.Link newsletter to get general updates on new content related to Cassandra. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and see you next time. Same place, same time. All right, bye-bye.